Thank you all for coming today. Those of you who are close enough can see I wore my Prince of Wales feathers shoes for the event, and I think Jamie Kabler will be so covetous he'll snatch them off my feet before the day is over. As for your phones, thank you for silencing them. At a garden party a while back for the Queen at Buckingham Palace, someone's phone went off and the Queen said, "Oh, is that for me?" So I'll have to ask if your phone rings, if it's for one of us up here. 110 years ago, some very solid men sat on what appeared to be very solid thrones throughout Europe and Eastern Europe. But 100 years ago, those were all wiped out. Tsars and Grand Dukes were dead or on the run. The Kaiser, who helped to start it all, was in refuge in Holland, excuse me. And the Holy Roman Empire, the vestiges of the Holy Roman Empire, were long gone. It wasn't just the hand of an anarchist, it wasn't just a mad monk from Siberia who brought this about, but the age of kings seemed to be over. But the king of Egypt said that by the end of the 20th century, there would remain only 5 kings: hearts, diamonds, clubs, spades, and England. He has proven to be right, and now we're going to find out why that's the case and whether, in fact, the British monarchy will, in time, join those defunct numbers. Of course, you know the guests. Philip Eade is the author of Prince Philip, the turbulent early life of the man who married Queen Elizabeth II, and Anne Sebba, the author of That Woman, the life of Wallis Simpson, the Duchess of Windsor. So thank you both for being here. And on the basis of what you say today, I'm going to go place my bets about the survival of the monarchy so it can make some money one way or the other out of this. Who knows? It's a large topic to undertake, but each of you has taken a look at a figure who's been seminal in the future and the fate of the British monarchy. And let me start with a quote from Anne's book, which is the questions about Wallis Simpson in all the decades since the 1936 abdication. Wallis, in her lifetime, defied her critics and yielded few secrets about what it was about her that forced a man to renounce everything he had been born to enjoy and to give up one of the most illustrious thrones in the world, because we cannot by any rational means explain why a middle-aged married woman with large hands and a mole on her chin convinced a troubled boyish prince to believe that his life could have no meaning unless he lived alongside her. And that is the Churchillian mystery inside a riddle wrapped in an enigma, I think. Let's start a little bit with Wallis Simpson and the significance that she has had in the modern history of the monarchy. My sense is that there should be a statue to her in Parliament Square because she took off the throne an extremely incompetent man.
You're absolutely right.
All right, 2 votes.
And of course, that's what Noel Coward famously said, a statue in every market town to Wallis Simpson. And I absolutely agree. And you didn't tell me what you were going to read, so I haven't prepared an answer at all. But what I think I want to share with all of you is that what I set out to do was to look at this riddle wrapped in an enigma. And nobody could understand at the time how on earth this woman captured this handsome, charming, wonderful prince. And that's indeed where I started. But once you turn the story on its head and you realize that she actually was not the hunter, she was the hunted. And that's really where I think I understood the story. I found these extraordinary letters between Wallis and Ernest. That's her second husband, Ernest Simpson, the man she was trying to divorce, the man she was publicly accusing of adultery and hatred. And in these letters that I discovered, it became quite clear that actually, not only did she love in a funny sort of way, Ernest, you know, too little, too late, but between them, they really described what Edward was like. And that was really my insight. They referred to Edward as Peter Pan, and she really knew. Wallis, and this is the real irony of the whole story, the least maternal of women, the woman who never wanted any children of her own, landed up with a great big adult baby. She knew that Edward could not face up to his responsibility. Edward starved himself to remain boyish and slim. I'm sure he was on the spectrum of numerous personality flaws, obsessive compulsive, but certainly anorexic. And by looking at Edward through Wallis's eyes, which nobody had really done, because, of course, in the public photographs, you see this terribly young and handsome prince, which as Prince of Wales he was. By the time he was king in January 1936, over 40, it was slightly, corroded. The charm had left him at that point. He was just plain difficult and awkward, and I think Wallis really knew that she had saddled herself with someone who threatened suicide 3 times, and when Wallis tried to break off the romance, he swore that he would come after her, and if he didn't find her, he'd slit his throat. He slept with a loaded gun under his pillow, according to one of the courtiers. He was not going to let her go, because I think deep down, and it's a very complex relationship, and it verges on sadomasochism, but he wanted to punish himself for not being able to be the macho figure that his father, George V, was, for not being able to do the one thing that a king's meant to do, produce an heir. So, he hadn't been allowed to fight at the front in World War II, in World War I, and all of these things he recognized were failures in himself. And I don't think consciously he wanted to abdicate. I think if he could have had Wallis by his side and had things how he wanted and tried to follow the American model, because that also is clear in his private letters, I think he would have taken the throne. But clearly he didn't really want it, and Wallis was his subconscious way out. So once you turn the story on its head and you see all his many flaws, and the fact that he saw Wallis as a way not to take on the throne, it's a very different story.
And now we see in Prince Philip, in Philip Eade's book, a man who has been the outrigger to the monarchy, who's kept the Queen stable in choppy waters, who has been a private refuge to a woman who has been stuck with her fate, I suppose, and has helped to make it tolerable what for her was truly a love match. I've met him a couple times, interviewed him, and he can be very funny and very witty and very charming. But as you write in his book, it was a knockabout life for him, even though he was meant to marry the future Queen of England by his uncle. It was a tough life for him for a while.
Well, he had a very tough childhood. I mean, I won't go into that in too much detail, but certainly by the time he took on the idea of marrying the Princess Elizabeth, I mean, he did act very much like the Queen Mother or the then Queen with George VI. He was like in the King's Speech. He was helping his future wife and then wife overcome this sort of shy. I mean, she was not really sort of cut out in many ways to be this public figure. I mean, she was a very shy person. I think, one of the big things he did was sort of help bring her out of herself. And when she would be sort of wandering around on walkabout in the early days, he was sort of very adept at sort of sauntering over and making some sort of quip which would somehow, allow the conversation to flow.
Like Wallis, he made compromises with this marriage.
He made huge compromises. I mean, he was an absolute sort of alpha male, extremely ambitious for his naval career, and he had to give it all up when George VI first got ill and then died. I mean, he gave it up during his illness, and they went off to on the Commonwealth tour in the King's place. But it was a sort of huge sacrifice for him, that, and to the extent that when George VI died, he plunged into a sort of massive depression, really, for a year or two. And really, the idea of this sort of, as I say, sort of complete alpha male having to then sort of walk 2 paces behind his wife for the rest of time. And I mean, we've seen in the famous car accident that came recently. I mean,
97 years old, and he's still driving sort of like a maniac.
But I mean, I think one of the reasons why he is because, I mean, like a lot of old people, that you become more and more stubborn. And he'd given up so many areas of his life where he was no longer the boss, but there were certain areas, particularly behind closed doors, where he made sure he was the boss. And the Queen was perhaps the only person who could have told him, I think maybe you better give up driving. But I just don't think she would have dared, actually. I mean, she's had too many days where, I mean, it's very well documented. Their sort of various flunkies along the years have always describing sort of furious rows between them, and him giving her very short shrift if she tried to, tell him what to do.
He was the first consort to a reigning queen since Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert. But Prince Albert had a lot of authority. He was virtually the queen in pants. He did all the paperwork. He wrote policy papers. And the queen was just sort of sitting there adoring. They had desks side by side. Whereas with Prince Philip, he was not allowed to look at the papers. He had no official position.
No, that's right. I mean, he was sort of shut out of everything. I mean, his later recollection was that there were plenty of people telling him what not to do, but not very many sort of ideas as to what he could possibly do, and that various sort of jobs were therefore sort of put his way because he was deemed to be insupportable when idle. It was said, and so he was there. He was given the job of organising the coronation, and then he. But anyway, he did gradually find ways of occupying his time, and he set up some very worthwhile organisations, the Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme and so on.
Temperamentally, and when we think of Edward VIII and saying, well, aren't we glad that we didn't get him, apart from his pro-fascist leanings, here's one ranking courtier who described him. I'm always astonished by his total inability to comprehend such ideas. Words like decency, honesty, duty, dignity, and so on meant absolutely nothing to him. If one said to him, but surely, sir, you can't do that, he would reply in genuine bewilderment, but I don't know what you mean. I know I can get away with it.
Yes, you're absolutely right. He was really a spoilt and difficult little boy. And that's why I don't really believe in these conspiracy theories that Wallis was set up to remove him. That's just too neat. It didn't happen like that. It doesn't fit the facts. But I do believe that many of his aides and courtiers who knew him well actually breathed a huge sigh of relief when it became clear that he wasn't going to be king, because he was just so difficult. He wouldn't take orders. And whereas, George V was a difficult man, but ultimately George V did what he was told. He recognized that there was a greater force at play, and he buckled in. And Edward somehow just didn't, and his courtiers despaired of him. But there are a couple of things you said. His pro-fascist leanings. I'm not, as you've probably gathered, his greatest defender, but actually I don't think he was pro-fascist. And I think
certainly pro-German, which was a different thing.
It is, and I'd really love to talk about that, because this is a conference about war, so let's worry about what would have happened if he'd been king during the war. He was in favour of appeasement, but he was deeply pro-German, and I think it's really, really interesting. Of course he was. The family was Saxe-Coburg until they became Windsor, so he felt German. He grew up feeling that he was close to all his German cousins, and he had many of them. He'd been taken to Germany. The one thing he did well was speak German. So of course he wanted to go to Germany. That he wanted to show off to Wallis on his honeymoon. Look, darling, how good I am at speaking German. But he went to Oxford. He was sent to Oxford, and he didn't actually finish his course, so he didn't completely get a degree. But he was taught by a very pro-Nazi tutor, Hermann Fiedler. And nobody seems to have realized this. I mean, Hermann Fiedler, who taught Edward, was praising Hitler right up until the last and saying, of course you should go to Germany, and organize these tours for Edward. So he was really familiar with Germans, and right up until the last minute he was trying to reach out and make peace. So, I absolutely agree with you. It's pretty dangerous if he'd been king right up until the last minute. I don't think we'd have had the resolve to fight. But fascist, I'm not so sure. I don't think he probably had the intelligence to disinter the two, but he was certainly pro-German.
Well, I had an old friend, Cleveland Amory, who was at first drafted to write the Duchess memoir for her, and he remembers going to dinner after dinner where they were both so anti-Semitic in their comments that he finally decided not to do the book. But part of the theme of this panel is, of course, about the future of the British monarchy. And this is a subject that is not new. It has come up every, probably 30, 40 years over the 1,000-plus history of the British monarchy. You had a country that cut off the head of its own monarch, Charles I. Then they brought over from Germany a man who didn't even speak English and came with his two mistresses. Britain was offended not by the fact that he had two mistresses, but that they were both ugly. And then with the wicked uncles, all the terrible children of George III, the king we kicked out of the country, Queen Victoria became queen, and they decided with Prince Albert they had to have a model monarchy that looked as much like a middle-class family as a monarch could in order to make it safe again, in order to establish the legitimacy of the monarchy. We're just like you, except with a lot of jewelry. So, Philip, can you talk about, from the work that you have done and your assessment of the risks that the tipping points where the monarchy felt throughout the life of Philip and through his influence, where it felt to be in danger and where he may have helped to bring it back toward the middle?
Well, I think the biggest danger point that springs to mind was the death of Diana, and I think that's the only time during the Queen's reign when the country sort of momentarily sort of wobbled in its opinion about her, and I think, I don't know what Prince Philip's was possibly perceived by the conspiracy theorists as sort of somehow being behind the whole thing, and I think it would take a stretch of the imagination to give any sort of credence to that. But I would say that and other things, I suppose, which take us on into the future. I suppose that the groundwork was sort of laid for, I think, problems ahead with the sort of soul bearing and emoting of both Charles and Diana, during their marriages, which both their children seem to have sort of followed this pattern. And I don't think the Queen and Prince Philip think that that's a terribly good idea, because one of the things about, I think, that has kept the British monarchy sort of intact in a way is yes, they've modernized to some extent, but I think they do still have to remain to some extent, there's a necessary aloofness, I think. Otherwise, once you become the same as everyone else, I don't know, I'm not sure it really works.
Well, and that's I'm sorry, Anne, go ahead.
No, sorry, I was just going to say it's one of the reasons why the Queen won't abdicate. I mean, abdication is such a dirty word that the Queen will carry on, even if she sort of passes on increasingly all her duties to her children and grandchildren because of what happened. From my perspective, obviously, I see the weakest point in 1936 when Edward abdicated and went abroad waiting to marry Wallis. He had to wait for the divorce to come through, which indeed it did, and it nearly hadn't, because she clearly had been, they both had been breaking the law. It was a collusive divorce, which was against the law of England at the time. Anyway, they agreed that Edward had to marry Wallis, and they did marry in 1937. But then the master stroke of the royal family, I think it'll survive, I don't suppose forever, but they're actually really clever. They're adept at changing according to the needs of the day and just being one step ahead. So what the royal family did in 1937 was they made Edward Duke of Windsor HRH, and Wallis was just plain old ordinary Duchess of Windsor, no royal initials. Now, why this was a master stroke? Of course, Wallis and Edward were furious, and it was corrosive, and they carried on battling for it. But what it means if you don't have royal initials, it means that when you meet somebody, they don't have to curtsy to you. So Edward said, how can I possibly bring my wonderful wife to England if she's going to be humiliated without royal initials? Nobody will curtsy to her. So effectively, they were created exiles. They didn't actually cleverly say, you're going to be exiled.
You're welcome back any time. Just nobody will curtsy.
Nobody will curtsy. So, Edward had thought that when he abdicated, he'd come back to Fort Belvedere and just lead the life of an ex-king with all the pleasures and none of the duties. Well, oh no, he wasn't going to have that. So, there was a fear that the dowdy Queen Mother, who wore these funny hats with flowers and, dowdy pastel colours, she was really worried that the elegant chic Wallis if they came back, there might be a King's party and that they would be threatened. So I think there was a real danger point there. And having overcome it, and then, of course, there was the Blitz when she proved the Queen Mother proved herself one of us. Now I can look the East End in the eye, she said, as, you know, as if they were equals. Ha ha. But anyway.
But it played very well with the masses.
Exactly. So I think having overcome that, the Queen will never abdicate. That's not acceptable. She'll remain, but she'll actually just pass over as much as she can. And, you know, who knows? It's a complete anachronism. I mean, it's a nonsense, isn't it?
And the other reason, too, is that part of the coronation is a religious ceremony. You are anointed, which doesn't mean you have a divine right, but you are anointed by the Archbishop. Prince Charles has said he will not be the defender of the faith, but the defender of faith, the concept of faith. So that matters a lot to the Queen, as it mattered to her forebears, too, that the religious
Yes, and it was one of the
it.
reasons why the Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Gordon-Lang, who's always portrayed as such a wicked figure, was desperately worried about anointing Edward VIII as king to uphold the law, because he knew perfectly well that he was actually subverting the law of the land in order to get this divorce from Wallis, which was a collusive divorce. So, you know.
Prince Philip had a lot of worldliness in his young life, which he ended up bringing that knowledge and that understanding into the royal family. He had a bisexual aunt who was a very glamorous figure. And he sort of presented himself as the guy who, let's bring in the new broom and sweep aside protocol and change things around here. And he got pushback from the courtiers, but at the same time, when it came to the Queen, and to some extent himself, he wanted things done comme il faut. He wasn't going to let anybody diss the Queen, and he didn't always take it for himself either.
No, that's right. I mean, I think he was a modernizer. That's right. He was a great sort of fan of technology, which he got from his partly from his Mountbatten uncle, who famously had a sort of a gadget that he got dressed in the morning. It was a sort of model of a man, and it was sort of, I don't know, he could sort of slip into it, and I think it had a pair of Y-fronts attached or something. He could. It was a sort of time-saving device, and
like Superman into his super clothes, or
anyway,
Batman,
Prince Philip's,
I suppose.
When they sort of redecorated Clarence's house, you know, Prince Philip's wardrobe was full of sort of gadgets. I mean, he was very annoyed when sort of details of this leaked to the press. But no, I think there were sort of two sides to him. He was, as you say, you know, a modern person. He didn't like being sort of kowtowed to too much. He didn't like people carrying his suitcases. But at the same time, I think he probably could chill, you know, unsuitable familiarity with a sort of, you know, a glare if the occasion arose.
Because he had such a knockabout life, how hard was it for him to take to truly royal life with the palaces and the rota of this place for shooting, this place for?
Well, I think you'll have all, probably a lot of you will have seen his portrayal in the Crown. I mean, we were just talking about that earlier. I mean, I think the Crown's a fantastic thing, and I find it a bit sort of tedious to nitpick too much the various sort of
I thought that was the fun of it.
discrepancies between it and the. But it, you know, I think by and large it's a very, you know, it's a very accurate portrayal. However, I do think Prince Philip is possibly one of the more miscast people. I mean, he was more royal than the Queen. His background was he had a royal princess, German princess mother, and a royal Greek prince from a Danish background father. I mean, the Queen only had, you know, royalty on her father's side. So in a way, he was posher than the Queen. And so with this idea that when he sort of got, you know, came to be marrying her, that he was somehow sort of wide-eyed and didn't know, you know, they met each other at countless sort of parties that were sort of given by the sort of pan-European royalty as they were growing up. And, you know, yes, their most significant first meeting was when she was 13 and he was 18 at Dartmouth, and she famously fell for him when he was sort of vaulting the tennis court nets while looking after the two princesses, and she never looked at another man. And by repute, and I think that's pretty much the case. I mean, he obviously did look elsewhere for a while, but she was only 13 at the time.
Well, now, because her marriage was going to be so important to the stability and the future of the monarchy, her parents had to take it much more than as just a romantic attachment that she formed. And they had their doubts about him and about how good a consort he would be. Talk about that.
Well, I mean, one of the main problems with him was that he was German, and that, you know, this was a year after the war, really, and you know, all his sisters had been married. I mean, 2 of them were married to SS officers, and you know, none of the sisters were invited to the wedding in 1947, not surprisingly. And also, the man who had sort of stage managed the whole love affair, really, which was his uncle, Louis Mountbatten, who was the king's ADC, and he arranged this Dartmouth meeting, and he, you know, at one point, Prince Philip was sort of had to plead with him, please, you know, let me sort of do this myself, don't sort of, you know, pull the strings or whatever. I can't remember. Do the wooing by proxy, I think was the expression he used. He wrote to his uncle sort of saying, you know, back off, I need to do this myself. But yes, no, the stuffier courtiers were very suspicious of Mountbatten. Mountbatten, you know, although it seems sort of odd now, was actually quite left wing, really. I mean, certainly by the standards of the sort of Buckingham Palace courtiers. And he, you know, it was felt, or rather sort of feared, that he was going to use his nephew, Prince Philip, as a kind of Trojan horse to sort of infiltrate the British monarchy and sort of reform it from within along lines that they were very uncomfortable with.
Well, he also, after the Queen was married and then when she became Queen, Lord Mountbatten proclaimed that the House of Mountbatten now ruled in Britain because this was supposed to be when the wife took her husband's name and Philip's name had been turned into Mountbatten. And Churchill put a stop to that, as did the Queen Mother, right?
Well, it's interesting, all this business of, you know, when Edward was worried about how he could marry Wallis, and there was a suggestion of a morganatic marriage. That was that they would just get married without her taking the title, and everyone.
Like Charles has now with Camilla, in a way.
Well, we don't quite know yet. I think the
We'll
jury's
have to
still out a bit on that.
whether she shows up at the Abbey on Coronation Day, like in a long
But
robe.
I mean, my point is just that they're very savvy when it comes to it, this royal family. You know, so when they didn't want Wallis, they said, oh, you can't have a morganatic marriage, that's not English. But, you know, when it suits them, Windsor, she is Windsor. So, you know, Philip doesn't keep his name.
And
so.
Philip had a fit and said, he showed his misunderstanding of biology because he was supposedly yelling, I'm just a bloody amoeba, when what he meant was a sperm donor. Am I right, Philip, with that?
Yes, I've forgotten what that was. The sort of, I think what he meant, meant, I think, was that his part in the reproductive process was not being
And his name was,
recognized.
yes, was being lifted off. So you discovered, Anne, these extraordinary communications like the ones between Ernest and Wallis while the abdication crisis was going on.
Yeah.
And I'm going to read a bit from one. She's writing 5 days after the abdication, Ernest, none of this mess is of my own making. It is the new Peter Pan plan. Peter Pan is what they call the king. I miss you and worry about you, in spite of the fact that due to the letters, meaning the hate mail, I shan't live very long, and in fact am a prisoner. 4 detectives. Oh dear, wasn't life lovely, sweet, and simple? She is really sorry, and she had almost 40 years more to be sorry.
I mean, you mentioned early on the words compromise and sacrifice. I mean, most people, up until I found these letters, would say, oh, Edward gave up the throne and the empire and the kingdom. What a huge sacrifice he made. That was the sort of standard version. But Wallis, of course, thought, I'm the one who's made the sacrifice. I've given up my good name. I've given up my ability to go to the hairdresser without being followed by paparazzi. She always thought when a flashbulb went off that it was someone actually going to take a pot shot at her. She was very fearful, and with good reason. And, you know, she thought, I can't go out freely. People think of me as a whore, as a Nazi, as a gold digger. I'm the one who's suffered. And that's really at the root of why everyone who knew them post-abdication said she behaved so badly. She publicly humiliated Edward, and he almost seemed to lap it up. He almost seemed to feel, I need to be punished. I've behaved so badly, and I deserve this. And then, some kind of sublime lovemaking probably made it all right in the end. I always say that a biographer should go right up to the bedroom door, but not actually go into the bedroom. So I can't tell you what happened in the bedroom, but I think we can deduce from these letters, which were extraordinary. And I don't want to talk too much about the letters, but again, one of the things I discovered was that actually Ernest Simpson, a generation back, a few years back, had been Jewish. He was actually Solomon. And so I don't think Wallis was anti-Semitic. I think Wallis knew perfectly well she was married to somebody Jewish. The family had a shipping, Anglo-Hamburg shipping line. And on one occasion when Ernest went to Hamburg, there's a letter where Wallis said she was very worried about him in Hamburg. She did love Ernest, but she had a funny way of showing it. She thought that actually the best way to show her love was to have this affair with the Prince of Wales. It would lift them both socially. They'd be several notches higher, because Ernest colluded in it. To begin with, Ernest was thrilled by it. He thought, this is wonderful. He was an arch snob. And she thought, well, they'll get rid of me when he's king. That's what happens to royal mistresses. And I'll end up with, a bit more money, a few jewels and furs. And Edward was salting money away for her in a trust fund in Canada. He had a ranch in Alberta. He offered to pay the rent on their flat in London because the shipping business was going badly. So, it was, what I learned from these letters was it was just a very muddled situation of all of them thinking, well, let's have fun while we can. But that's not what Edward thought. He thought this is for real.
And for life, for keeps.
Yeah.
So, Philip, where do you think Prince Philip has had his strongest influence on the future, the stability of the present-day monarchy and on in? I mean, some of his more off-color and off-the-cuff comments have certainly generated criticism. But you do think the Queen couldn't have done the job without him. On the other hand, 3 of his 4 children are divorced. His eldest son and heir is exactly the opposite of Pa, and wants to be not very much like him. So where has Philip influenced and left his mark?
Well, I think, it's a slightly sort of boring answer, but I think it is really as this sort of support for the Queen, but whose reign is, I think now will go down as possibly the most successful reign that the country has known, really. So it's the longest. She seems to be sort of almost beyond. There are criticisms one can make of her, but she, it's. I think when she dies, there'll be a huge sort of. It will come as a huge shock to the country, and I think. I think his main role, as I say, was to sort of bolster her when she was young, and then just keep her spirits going, so that she's been able to reign in the way she's been able to for so long.
They work jolly hard, though,
They work very hard, but one of the but the lack of public pronouncements, I think, by the Queen, which is all that's where I think people are worried about the change. I read the other day that sort of said that the Queen virtually says nothing. I mean, I think Jackie Kennedy once complained to Gore Vidal that talking to her was very heavy going, and he said this to Princess Margaret, and Princess Margaret said, "But that's what she's there for, and to be heavy going." And meanwhile, Prince Philip never says anything other than to make some massively inappropriate remark.
I just have to say, after I'd met him first with an interview, and it was in a drive from LAX to Caltech, and then the second time I met him, somebody had briefed him very well, because he announced to all and sundry, "I'll have you all know I spent an hour in the back seat of a car with this young woman." So there's a perfect example of what you're talking about.
But I mean, it's a big change now that we're sort of seeing with, and I think that the jury is obviously still out on the sort of younger, Prince William, Prince Harry. But I think it's, this sort of sharing their feelings and their struggles or mental health or whatever with the public, I think, it's obviously popular and good and does do good, but it may have sort of, it may be sowing seeds of sort of danger. I think sort of some sort of royal historians might be worrying, is this where it all started to go wrong, I think. And as I say, that has its roots, some in the sort of Diana, Charles sort of.
Well, We'll go to questions in a moment, but Anne, what do you think as far as this grand pronouncement about the future of the monarchy? Is it in good hands? I think Charles' reign will be a very short one,
Yes.
just because of longevity, and then we'll have William.
I think they're figureheads, and as long as they absolutely stick to that. I mean, Philip said they rarely put a foot wrong, but just last week, the Queen made some pronouncement which at one level you would think, well, that's harmless enough. She called on the British people to come together and to show forgiveness and to understand each other. And it was clearly a message about Brexit, which we're struggling with. And it was interpreted as a political message because Theresa May had a critical vote. And actually what the Queen was saying is, don't rock the boat, don't argue with Theresa May. Let's all forgive her and come together. So it was actually a political pronouncement. And the headlines were very clear. So, she's the Queen. She can do it because everybody thinks she's amazing. She's worked so hard. She's, really, there's hardly a day when she doesn't go somewhere. She opens factories. She opens schools. And so all of that is people are grateful for what she does because it brings in money from all the tourists who come and want to look over Buckingham Palace. But I think they'll last as long as people say, well, what's the alternative? The alternative is a president, and that way lies corruption, because who would we have? And there's, it's better to have somebody who we all agree is completely anachronistic. I mean, to believe in the divine right of kings is a nonsense, it's bonkers, but they are there, and they sell newspapers, they help to revive the economy. So as long as they don't step out of line and remain figureheads, then I think they're okay. But I wouldn't want to put a time limit on it.
Can I just sort of add something to what you said? I mean, from a British perspective, I mean, they are about our only world-class thing left, really. I mean, we the only thing that we conceivably, can sort of boast about. And I read this thing the other day, which struck me as a sort of, because one of the arguments is, one of the questions is, will they survive? And the other is, should they survive? And it was a man recalling the visit of Nelson Mandela to London in 1996, 5 years after his being released from prison, and sort of 2 years after becoming president of South Africa. And he went to plant a tree in St. James's Park, and this man who just took his son along to watch him was struck by this sort of beatific smile that he had on his face. And Nelson Mandela had just walked up the road from Buckingham Palace, where he'd stayed and been sort of treated as sort of number one guest by the Queen, and he made a speech about how the hospitality was sort of beyond words, and this man was struck by the sort of journey from his prison bed to where he slept last night. A president just couldn't give you that, whereas the royal family, it is something that we can, besides sort of tourism, it gives you that sort of little diplomatic sort of something that very few other countries can offer, really. I mean,
it's what happens when you split the head of state and the head of government. The head of state gets to be blinged out. So.
It sells designer dresses as long as we have Meghan and Kate.
Let's sell some questions. I need you to stand up and say it, and then I will repeat the question for the audio. So who shall be first? The last shall be first, so if you don't, I will. No, seriously. I can't believe they've answered all of your questions. So let's talk about, yes, all right. Can you stand up so I can hear you, please?
It's down on the subject. I want to know what's true about Meghan and Kate. Are they really fighting?
The question about Meghan and Kate, and I don't know, but I don't think if you can address that, fine, but I think the larger question is, here you have an American divorcee, where have we heard this before, marrying into the royal family, in this case, a woman of mixed race. So perhaps that has something to do with the future of the monarchy as well.
Yeah, I don't think Meghan is similar to Wallis, if that's the sort of subtext.
No, but times have changed.
But exactly, there's hardly a family in Britain that doesn't have somebody divorced, and divorce is legal. And he's sixth in line to the throne. He's not going to be king. So really we can cut him some slack. And anyway, everyone loves Harry. He's had a tough life, so let him marry who he wants. But is she similar to Wallis? I don't really think so. She's...
No,
Oh,
but
sorry.
I don't think you can't speak to the Kate Meghan Markle feud, can you?
I should think Kate is a little bit concerned if it gets out of hand because she doesn't want anything to rock the boat. And whereas Kate is absolutely straight down the middle, she may see Meghan not as overshadowing her, but as saying something or causing a rift that could make the whole royal family slightly criticised. That's my reading of it, but I don't think it's a
Well,
huge great
that
rift.
happened with Diana and Sarah Ferguson, because Sarah was very popular with Prince Philip and with the Queen, and Diana was much more the fey, detached creature. Philip, have you anything to weigh in
To add
on this?
on Meghan and
On
Kate.
Meghan and Kate? What have they told you?
I'm not sure I have much of an insight. I mean, I would say that Kate sort of represents sort of solidity. She, you know, I think one of the great things she's brought to the sort of monarchy is this idea that, you know, that they're not all upper class, whatever. You know, she's from an ordinary middle class family, and that's all very good because it lessens the sort of accusations that can be made that they're some sort of elitist. But Meghan Markle takes it to another sort of thing, which is it's a sort of celebrity, you know, actress, film thing, and there's no reason why an actress can't be a good princess. We had Grace Kelly, and very successful princess in Monaco, but I think I don't know. I think people. I suspect they don't probably get on. My guess would be that they don't necessarily get on that well, but it is a guess.
All I would add to it is just an insight into, I'm sorry to say as a journalist, and I'm proud of being a journalist, but how the media inflames this. I was called by the Sun newspaper. If you don't know what the Sun is, it's sort of
Got the topless girl on page 3. That's all you need
and
to
they
know.
called me about a month ago to ask if I'd write about how Meghan was like Wallis and how Meghan was going to destroy the royal family and the arguments between Meghan and Kate. And I said, I'm really sorry, I'm just not privy to all of this. I don't think I could do it. And the commissioning editor was really twisting my arm to write this article and say, but you could say, couldn't you, that X happened, and you could say that she's fired all her staff, and you could say that Kate has said this. And I said, well, I'm really sorry, I don't know that, I can't do it. And this conversation went on for about half an hour, and I didn't write the article, but it just gives you an insight into how this whole thing is being, you know, the flames are being fanned by the media, is my
You've heard the phrase
view.
cottage industry. This is a palace industry. Yes.
How do the Brits feel about Meghan being an American, and how do they feel about her being mixed race?
All right. How do the British feel about Meghan being American and about being mixed race? In fact, it wasn't being American that was the problem with Wallis.
No, it was the fact that she had 2 living husbands. I think they thought there was going to be blackmail from the other husbands. Well, I can't speak as to how the British feel, but I think the royal family has achieved a great coup. I mean, I'm sorry, it's what I said before. I think they're really savvy, really clever, moving with the times. You know, look how modern we are. We're embracing, isn't this wonderful? I think it's a real palace coup to welcome her with open arms.
Philip?
Well, I agree. I think the fact that she's American, the fact she's mixed race, all big pluses. But I think the only danger is if, you know, if she then sort of is sort of absorbed into the royal family and does things that the royal family, you know, I suppose it's whether she tries to sort of take Harry in a direction that you know, that is somehow sort of, you know, not what royals do, I suppose. That's
You mean
where
being vegan?
well, being vegan, I think is
Yoga at
fine.
dawn.
Although, you know, you do hear whispers that he, you know, a lot of Harry's friends sort of mutter that he's been sort of, you know, that he's been.
We
sort
know
of
the word, yes.
demasculated, I think, by his
That
by
probably
his wife.
says a lot about his friends, doesn't
Well,
it?
but he was a bit of a Jack the Lad. You know,
One more question. Okay, let's go over there. Stand up and so I can hear you, please.
What I found when I go to England is that how many people dislike Camilla. What is going to happen, do you think, when Charles becomes
Okay. What will happen when Charles becomes king? Because early on, the sense was that, no, don't worry, she's not going to be queen. She didn't take the title Princess of Wales because it was already taken by Diana. So this is very much appropriate to the future of the monarchy. In the minute we have left, can you speak to what you think will happen when Charles becomes king? Will Camilla be that morganatic wife, or will she become queen consort?
Well, I can only speak as a writer. Camilla's done an awful lot for fellow authors, actually. She's a patron of a number of authors' organizations. So friends of mine who have met her say she's, and also osteoporosis, because her mother died of osteoporosis. I mean, she's got many, many other charities, but those are just two I know of. And she's hugely liked and works hard and is considered a fantastic influence on him. So perhaps I'm speaking to a prejudiced audience, but they're prejudiced in her favor. And I think the view that I get is that she's terrific and really good news, and she's put up with an awful lot and managed to keep Charles on the straight and narrow. So perhaps I'm giving you a different view.
That's all we will have time for. I think Anne will be around a bit afterwards. Thank you all for coming today.